Hello, friends. Welcome back to the While We're Waiting Hope After Child Loss podcast. I'm Jill Sullivan, your host and one of the co-founders of the While We're Waiting ministry. We're excited this week to be preparing for our first ever While We're Waiting weekend in Columbus, Georgia, as well as a While We're Waiting weekend at beautiful North Bay Adventure Camp on the Chesapeake Bay in Maryland, where we've hosted many events over the last several years. Brad and I will be at the retreat in Georgia, and we're so excited about the moms and dads we'll be meeting there. We'd love to serve you at one of our free retreats one day. For more information or to register, just visit our website at whilewe'rewaiting.org. Today's episode is the first half of a two-part conversation with Kirsten Black, author of the Faithful Paradox blog. Kirsten and her husband Vince live in Fort Collins, Colorado, where they moved several years ago to help plant a church. They're the parents of 5 boys, and Kirsten describes their home as wonderfully and sometimes overwhelmingly full of life. But in 2022, their family story took a devastating turn when their oldest son, Ezra, was diagnosed with leukemia. After a difficult 14-month battle, Ezra went to heaven. About a year and a half later, Kirsten began writing about her journey of faith and grief on her blog, Faithful Paradox. In it, she explores the tension many grieving believers feel, the reality that we know God's promises are true, yet in the middle of suffering, those truths can feel confusing, distant, or difficult to reconcile with our pain. In this first half of our conversation, Kirsten shares about Ezra, his personality, his love of soccer and music, and the way he made people feel seen and valued. She also talks about the long road from his initial illness to his diagnosis, the intense months of treatment that followed, and the honest conversation she wrestled through with God during that time. Later in the episode, we begin discussing a blog post Kirsten wrote titled 10 Things That Are Different from What I Expected, in which she reflects on the many ways grief has reshaped her life and faith. This is a thoughtful and deeply honest conversation about faith, suffering, and the paradox many of us experience as grieving but believing parents, and I believe you'll be blessed by listening in. Hi, Kirsten. Thank you so much for joining me on the podcast today.
Thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to chatting with you.
Yes, I have been looking forward to it as well. I would love for you to take a couple of minutes and tell the listeners a little bit about yourself. Tell us where you're from and what life is like for you there.
Sure. I am from Fort Collins, Colorado. We're about an hour north of Denver. My husband and I moved here in 2010 to plant a church. It's called the Town Church. I've been married since 2000 to Vince, and I've primarily been a stay-at-home mom with a few stints of working outside the home here and there. I have been a mom to 5 boys, and then we have 2 dogs, also boys named Steve and Mike.
Well, you are outnumbered in your house, aren't you?
I am. We used to have backyard chickens, and my boys used to try to console me by telling me there were more girls than boys. And I was like, no,
Right.
It doesn't work that way. So
Not quite the same. Yeah. Well, that's nice to have a house full of boys like that. I love that. So we're here today to talk about your son, Ezra. I'd love for you to take a few minutes and tell us about him. Help us get to know him a little bit.
Sure. He was our firstborn, oldest of 5 boys. Ezra lived and breathed soccer. He started playing soccer when he was 5 years old, and I think all of his brothers followed in his footsteps. So we unknowingly stepped into becoming a soccer family, and I was a soccer mom through and through. His favorite team was Liverpool Football Club. He was a leader by nature, huge extrovert. I think the more people, the better for him. And he cared deeply about people. After Ezra died, we heard from a lot of people that told us about seemingly really insignificant interactions they had with Ezra that really affected them. And he had this really unique way of making people feel seen and loved in the way that he engaged them. And then God also gave Ezra just this incredible talent with music. He taught himself to play piano and guitar. He couldn't read music, but he played well enough to be on the worship team at church. And he was also just one who knew how to pick up a song and play it. And he would just sit down and play the piano over and over and over again. So yeah, he was a really just unique, gifted young man.
I love that. It sounds like he has many talents, but the one that seems most special to me is the fact that he saw people.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, he really did. His senior year, he got sick his senior year, but that year he had been voted like the student, they call it school captain. It's like student body president. And he was funny because he had run for office every year in high school and they had not won. And every year that he lost, he's like, okay, I just need to get to know people more and let them know that I care about them. And so
Ah,
he kind of made that his goal throughout high school, is just loving people well. And he ended up, getting that student body president his senior year, and, just had a pretty profound impact on a lot of people in his life.
that's wonderful. So Ezra is a good, solid biblical name.
Hmm.
How did you choose that name for him?
Yeah, for each of our boys, we decided to pick the original Hebrew meaning of their name and then find a psalm that went with that. And it was really fun and creative for the first like one, two, maybe three boys. But when we had five boys, we were really struggling to
Sure.
find names.
It's
So
a
my
lot of
youngest
pressure
son's
to put
name
on
is
yourself.
yeah, my youngest son's name is Uzziah. So that's a pretty unique name. But
Yeah.
Ezra means help, and Jude means praise. And so we pulled that from Psalm 63, 3 and 7. So it says, because your steadfast love is better than life, my lips will praise you, for you have been my help, and I will sing for joy in the shadow of your wings.
I love that. A name rich with meaning.
Hmm. Yeah, and we just spent time for each of our boys, just praying their verses for them.
Yeah.
And it's just been neat to see the kindness of the Lord in helping each of our boys grow into the names that we've given them.
hmm That's great. So you mentioned that he started to get sick. At what point did you realize there was something seriously going on with him?
He got a cold in April of 2021, and that was still kind of all of the aftermath of COVID. And so, for a while there, we just thought maybe this is lingering COVID, maybe he has long COVID. And so he just never got better. And by like June, he would go to soccer practice, but he'd just have to sit out because he couldn't breathe. And I'd taken him to either like urgent care or his pediatrician 5 times over the course of 3 months, trying to figure out what was going on. And they just couldn't nail anything down. So we actually had an appointment with a pulmonologist in August of that year at Children's Hospital. But in July, he went to a soccer camp, and his coach was calling my husband. He's like, Ezra is super sick. He's sleeping all the time. He's got a high fever. Like, he can't participate in anything. And so we were trying to figure out, like, do we fly him home? Do we go out and get him? Do we have the coach take him to the hospital? We just didn't know what to do. So we decided, it was only a 2-day camp. So we decided we would just have him come home with the team and just take him to the ER at that point, because we had taken him to doctors now at this point 5 times and there just hadn't been anything clear. And the ER is, they're masters at being diagnostics. And so my husband took him to the ER and he was there for 5 or 6 hours. And at that point, my husband called me and said they think Ezra has leukemia. They're putting him on an ambulance and sending him to Children's Hospital. It took a while to diagnose it because they actually thought their blood reading machine was broken because his hemoglobin was so low
Wow.
that he should have not been alive with as low as his hemoglobin was. So yeah, so I mean, it was probably April, May. It was 3 months from when he first got a cold to when he was actually diagnosed with leukemia, and it got progressively worse over those months.
hmm Did the doctor talk to you about a prognosis at that point?
It took about, I don't know, 4 or 5 days because they had to figure out what type of cancer it was, and they had a hard time figuring out if it was AML or ALL or what type of leukemia it was. And then once they figured out what type it was, then they had to, I guess AML it's not staged like other cancers, like, stage 1, 2, 3, or 4. it's staged based on risk of relapse. And
Mm.
so, and that's all based on genetic testing. And so Ezra was given the highest risk of relapse, which is the worst type of
Mm.
AML.
Yeah.
And that determines the course of treatment. And so if you have the highest risk of relapse, then you'll automatically get a bone marrow transplant. And so Ezra had 2 or 3 rounds of pretty intense chemo. They were all inpatient. And then he had a bone marrow transplant in December of 2022.
Wow. It's a lot for a
Yeah.
young man to have to go through from being an athlete, a soccer athlete, which is a
Yeah.
high level athlete, to being hospitalized and going through chemotherapy and all of that. That's a tough
Yeah.
transition to make.
Yeah. It was really hard. It was hard for the whole family. I mean, the
Yeah.
hospital is about 90 minutes away from us. And so one of us would stay with Ezra at the hospital. And then if I was at the hospital, my husband would stay home with the other 4 boys. And then we would rotate about every 3 or 4 days. So,
Hmm.
it was a lot for Ezra and a lot for our family to have to endure.
Yeah. A childhood cancer diagnosis truly impacts everyone in the family
Yeah, it
in
really does.
profound ways. Yeah. So, what were your conversations with God like in those early months after his diagnosis?
Yeah, I mean, I think I started out doing a lot of fasting and praying and just asking
Mm.
God for healing. And I tried to have faith to believe that God was going to heal him. At the same time, we have a son who, when he was 8 months old, was diagnosed with a oftentimes fatal catastrophic pediatric seizure disorder. And it seemed like God was healing him for a season, and then it all stopped. And so I think I wrestled a lot with doubt, and not doubting God necessarily, but doubting that God would heal Ezra, because our experience with my son Solomon was such that, you know, he didn't heal him. And Solomon is now developmentally disabled because of that seizure disorder. And so I think I wanted to have a lot of faith. I wanted to really believe that God would show favor and would heal him. And I also really struggled to pray with faith that God was going to heal him. It felt like my faith kind of ebbed and flowed, believing that no, God was going to bring healing. And then other times I was like, I just don't know, trying to prepare yourself maybe for the worst in that. My husband just kept encouraging our family to look at the long-term goal, that these months of intense suffering were for the life that Ezra was going to live. And so we just prayed to that end. And I fought to believe that God would heal him. And I felt like, yeah, there were times, again, that faith felt sure and solid, and other times that I really struggled.
Hmm. Yeah, I understand that because, again, we walked a cancer journey with our daughter. I think you know
Mm-hmm.
that. And she was diagnosed with a grade 4 glioblastoma, which
Mm,
is considered a terminal diagnosis.
yeah,
And while I had faith that God could heal her, and I certainly prayed for that healing, that
yeah,
was the deepest desire of my heart. I think intellectually I knew that he may choose not to heal her on this earth,
yeah,
that with that diagnosis, her healing might come in heaven. And so,
yeah,
yeah, that's how I felt too during those months that Hannah was sick and praying for healing. And I didn't really think of it as a lack of faith because I knew whatever God did would be right.
mm-hmm.
I just knew what I wanted him to do.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And it's a hard process of surrender there. I think it's
Yes.
a really painful process of getting to a point of being able to pray, not my will, but yours be done, and
Yes.
actually mean it.
Yes.
Um, and for me, I think that looked like getting to a point of saying, Lord, I know whatever you do, I'm going to be okay. Like, I
Yeah.
know you're going to hold my faith. I know you're going to cause me to endure. So please, please don't take Ezra. Like, please, would you heal him? But even if you don't, I know I'm going to be okay. And I feel like
Yeah.
that's what surrender finally looked like for me.
Yes. It's that even if you don't.
Mm-hmm.
That's that point of surrender that
Yeah.
we reached as well.
Yeah.
So how long did Ezra battle his cancer?
His total battle was 14 months.
Mm.
So he was diagnosed in July of 2021. Nope, 2022. Nope, 2021.
Uh-huh.
And then all those dates kind of blend together.
Sure.
And then he had a bone marrow transplant December of 21. And then he got home in about March of 2022. And then he had about 3 months that he felt really good,
Mm.
March, April, May. And then he relapsed again in June of 2022, and we lost him in September of 2022.
Mm-hmm. Wow. A tough journey for sure. So about a year and a half after Ezra went to heaven, you began writing a blog, and you titled it Faithful Paradox.
Yeah.
Why did you choose that title? What does that mean to you?
I think, a paradox is a statement or situation that may be true, but sometimes it seems impossible or difficult to understand. And I think that's what faith felt like for me in a lot of ways. We know that God's word is true. Like, we know that we can stand on the truth of scripture, and we can know it intellectually, but there's a lot of times, especially when we're suffering, that these things simply don't feel true. And so fighting to remain faithful with the things that God has told us are true, even though they feel difficult to understand and certainly don't feel true at times.
Yes, I can relate to that as well. I love that title because it just describes a lot of just how I have felt in the years since Hannah's diagnosis and since she went to heaven. It is a paradox, and it is a faithful paradox. So very well titled blog.
Well, thank you.
In the introduction to your blog, you say this: I hope some of the things you read may encourage you to remain faithful even when you feel confused by God. From what I've read of your posts, you are accomplishing that purpose. How has writing helped you work through your own confusion with God?
Yeah, I think it's forced me to ask hard questions and also bring some measure of reconciliation to my own questions. I've read a lot of books in my life that tell me about where I'm supposed to be in my faith and how good and right faith is supposed to look. But I've not read many things on the struggle of actually getting there and on the
Yeah.
reality of the battle of faith. And
Yes.
so I think it's easy for us to kind of get lost in our own heads. And as we think about hard things and as we kind of confront some of these questions, but to actually put these things into words and put it out there for other people to read, it requires a certain measure of wrestling and settling into belief. And I think there's a weightiness that comes when you put your words and doubts out there publicly. But I also think that's where the Lord really uses the words, because they're not just like theoretical words based on robust theology, but they're actually tried and tested and tied to suffering and proven to be true. And so I just think there's something powerful in hearing that someone struggles with your deepest doubts and yet also seeing how God has been faithful to help that person remain faithful despite those doubts. And then I think also some of my boys read the blog, and I want to write in such a way that both shares honestly with them the struggle of faith, but also points them towards Jesus and just God's faithfulness, to see that God is faithful even when we do struggle and when we do wrestle, that it's not a dangerous thing to ask these questions or press into these hard things.
Mm-hmm. I love that. I hadn't thought about that as a model for your boys, for them to be able to read how you have struggled through these things and how God has met you in that struggle. Yeah, that's a great purpose for your blog, in addition to the other people who read it, for your own family. I love that. All of your posts are so rich, and I could have mined each one of them for multiple questions to ask you today. We could probably talk for a couple of hours. But there's one particular post that you wrote that really encapsulates a lot of what you write about. And it's titled 10 Things That Are Different from What I Expected. And you published it on March 4th, 2025, which was about 2.5 years after Ezra died. when I found that post, I shared it with our support group as a devotional at one of our meetings, and it led to a lot of really good conversation. Everybody in there could relate to those 10 points, and I could relate to them as well. So let's jump into these. I'm going to list them one at a time, and we can discuss these 10 things that are different from what you expected.
Sure.
Number one, I can so relate to this one. I thought there was a timeline.
Yeah.
What about that?
Yeah, I think we're often really quick, without realizing it, we're quick to impose a timeline on how another person grieves,
Yes.
especially when the grief is not our own. And so it's easy to assume that someone should get over something or handle their pain differently than they do. And I think it's also easy to assume that someone has gotten over something too quickly,
Yeah.
or maybe they should carry their pain for longer. And so I think it's easy to, again, without realizing it, impose our own views on others when it comes to grief. And this is something I used to do often without realizing that I was doing it.
Yeah, I did that as well. I know I did. I was completely ignorant of how long grief lasts. And you
Mm-hmm.
said that about you assumed that there was a timeline for other people. I assumed there was a timeline for myself, that at some point, maybe I was pretty ignorant, because I thought maybe 3 months, 6 months, surely by a year, I would be so much better. That the
Yeah.
timeline of my grief, that at some point was going to hit an expiration date, or was at least going to change, where I was going to, just take off in a different trajectory. What about that
Yeah.
timeline of grief for yourself? What did you find out about that?
Yeah, I think I thought once I hit the 1 year mark, because you experience all the firsts. You have your first Christmas and your first Mother's Day and your first birthday, and you have all the firsts. And so I think I thought we'd hit the 1 year mark, and then it would kind of shift. And I realized, like, there's no sense of accomplishment in making it to the first year. The first year actually stirred a ton of more grief in me, because it was this reality of, like, we've only made it a year and I'm still this sad and it's
Yes.
still this hard and I have a lifetime to go.
Yes.
And so I think that was one piece that felt really just devastating and disappointing, because I think I had hoped that maybe if I make it through the first year, then we're going to turn a corner and everything's going to get better. And it didn't. I think for newly bereaved parents, which was so deeply discouraging for me to hear, but like the first 2 years are just it's just so hard. Like
Yes.
it's just a constant, exhausting battle of endurance. And things do start to lighten, but it took a lot longer than I think I ever realized.
Yes. And hopefully that's an encouragement for somebody that's listening today, who may be in that second year and wondering, what's wrong with me? Why am I not
Yeah,
better? I should be better by now.
yeah,
To realize that no, it takes far longer
yeah,
than you would think. And
yeah,
that seems like a discouragement, but when you're in the middle of it, I actually think it can be encouraging to hear that it's not just you. There's not something wrong with you.
yeah. I think for me, the discouraging piece was just, again, how long I'm a very efficient person.
Yes,
So
me
I
too.
like to
Yeah,
do things very efficiently, and there was no efficient way to grieve.
right.
There's no efficient way to get through grief. Like, you just are at the mercy of what grief demands. And I felt really, I think there's also just the beginning, it's just so hard and you're just so sad for so long, and you do wonder, is it ever going to lift? Is it ever going to be better? Am I ever going to feel like I can live again? And it takes a really long time to get to a point that some of that lifts. And so hearing, no, it's a couple of years, I was like, oh, that's not efficient. And
Right.
I don't want to carry this for that long.
Yes.
But, in God's kindness, He just helped me really take the first couple of years to really intentionally press into grief and do the hard work of grieving. And so, yeah, I can say we're 3.5 years now, and it's significantly different. There's still some really hard days. It's still there, but it's not as heavy as it was those first couple of years.
Yeah. I've experienced that as well. And it just thinking about being a person who likes efficiency, those of us who are that way, we like to be able to check something off
Hmm.
the list and say, okay, I've completed that task. Now I can
Uh-huh.
go on to the next one. Grief does not work that way.
It does not at all.
No,
Not at
and that
all.
can be frustrating when you thought there was going to be a timeline, you thought there was going to be, an end or at least a shift, like you said,
Hmm.
and it takes much longer than you thought it would.
Yeah.
So number 2 on your list of things that you did not expect or that were different than what you expected, it says, I thought I would go back to who I used to be.
Hmm.
Talk about that.
Yeah, I think I thought with grief that, if you kind of picture like a line and then an event happens and you kind of dip down and then you V back up and then come back. I kind of pictured grief like that. Like I thought there was this devastating event, you have to endure it, and then you kind of pop back up and you keep going. And I didn't realize that losing a child like dramatically changes who you are.
Yes.
It's not that you lose pieces that end up coming back, but there's pieces of you that change that you didn't realize may not ever come back. And so, like for myself, I used to have a very high capacity. I used to feel like my brain was very sharp. I could remember dates and times and details with no problem. I was a very strong and present leader. And now I feel like my capacity is pretty low. I struggle to remember details. I have to set so many I think I had like 4 reminders on my calendar for this podcast today because I'm
Right.
like, I'll forget,
Sure.
I'll forget. And not because I don't
Yes.
feel like it's important. My brain just doesn't remember things.
Yes.
I much prefer to be in the shadows still rather than in leadership roles. I get overwhelmed really easily, especially in large crowds, loud spaces, and that's just not how I used to be at all. And I think when we first lost Ezra, I kept waiting for these pieces to come back. And I actually had a friend say to me, Kirsten, what if those pieces never do come back? And that was a point at which I had to kind of start embracing the fact, like, oh, I've actually really changed.
Yes.
And my husband changed a lot also with his with grief, and that was a really difficult piece of marriage for us because you know, Ezra was in the hospital for 10 of the 14 months that he was sick. And so Vince and I were living in separate places for 10 of those 14 months. And in that time, just going through everything that we went through with Ezra, like it changed us who we were as people. And so we came back together and stepped into a marriage that felt really unfamiliar and engaging with a husband that felt really foreign because he had changed and I had changed. And so I think, again, there was this hope that, okay, we just need to give it time and then we'll come back to who we were and everything will kind of move forward and feel normal. And what I realized is we had to relearn who we were and also who the other person was and learn then how to engage differently.
Hmm. I have said before that the loss of a child changes a person at the cellular level.
Mm-hmm.
After Hannah
Yeah.
went to heaven, I'm like you. I thought I would go back to the person that I was before.
Mm-hmm.
It just made sense. Like you said, a little dip for a while, and then
Mm-hmm.
eventually you come back up and you're the same person. But I was not, and I've never been that same person again.
Yeah.
Um, every fiber of my being has changed. And yeah, you throw in a spouse that also is now a different person. We didn't
Mm-hmm.
have as much separation as you guys did during Hannah's
Yeah.
illness. We were able to most nights at least be home together or have seen each other during the day. That's a really tough one to walk back into a marriage when you are two different people. It takes a
Yeah.
lot of
And you're
patience
both
to work through that.
grieving.
Yes.
Yeah, you're two different people and you're grieving, which, it's challenging.
Yeah. And if you have children in your home,
Hmm.
they are also becoming different people because of
Yep.
the journey of grief. Yeah.
Yeah.
Very challenging. That's what we need to depend on the Lord for all of these things, don't we?
Yeah. And just to encourage any listeners that if you find yourself in that place, like you are going to figure out who you are and the person that God is creating through this. There's a lot of beauty and good to
That's
it.
right.
And so
That's right.
I think it feels like insult to injury in some ways, that you're losing a piece of yourself and you're losing parts of you that felt safe and familiar. And so there's even more grief that can come with that. But, pressing into the Lord and knowing that He's refining you and making you more like Christ through all of this, and that the person that's going to be coming out on the other side is going to look more like Jesus.
That's right. Like I said, I am a different person, but in many ways, I am a better person than I was before. I'm closer to God. My faith has been strengthened. There's so many things. I have more compassion, more empathy for people than I did before. So being different is not necessarily a bad thing. It's just something we have to adjust to. It can be a good thing.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Completely unexpected, though. Not what either one of us thought would come out of grief. Number 3 on your list was, I thought grief was an event. What did you mean by that?
I think I thought that grief was something that happened. Like there's an event that happens, you grieve it, and then you just move on. I thought it was something that happens to you. But again, tying into the previous one, it changes you and it becomes a piece of who you are. So I think in a lot of ways, I'm a different person. I'm softer, I'm more tender than I used to be, but I'm also more fragile. I feel like I break a lot easier than I used to. And it's not just because something happened. It's not just because I lost my son, but it's everything that encompassed that.
Yeah, and grief is not just an event, it's a process. It's an ongoing process that we really will be walking through for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I mean, just this past week was Thanksgiving. And I can't remember if Ezra liked Thanksgiving or not.
Oh,
And, and I've asked my family, and none of us have specific memories of Ezra with Thanksgiving. And it like stirred all of this grief in me all over again. And so, so the event of losing Ezra, yes, it was an event, but it's also been a process and it's a process now that tiny little things or big things kind of trigger that all over again and stir stuff up all over again. And so, it affects every piece of who you are and how you think and how you process things.
Kirsten's reflections are so thoughtful and honest, and we're only about halfway through the list from her post, 10 Things That Are Different from What I Expected. In the next episode, we'll continue our conversation and talk about several more things that surprised her about grief, like learning that people in the same family often grieve very differently, why healing can bring its own kind of sadness, and how faith in Christ doesn't necessarily make the pain of loss easier, even though it gives us hope. Kirsten offers encouragement for parents who may be in the very early days of their grief journey, so be sure to join us again next week. Thanks again for listening, and I look forward to sharing the rest of our chat with you next Wednesday.